The Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, 1237 to 1240, and Belarus. The Mongols, led by Batu Khan, devastated the once glorious cities of the Kievan Rus, including Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev, leading to the collapse of the Kievan Rus as a powerful entity. The destruction had profound political, social, and cultural repercussions, not only for the Rus states but also for the wider region. The invasion is often seen as the beginning of the Mongol domination of Eastern Europe, a period that lasted for several centuries and left an indelible mark on the region's history. Before the Mongol invasion, Kievan Rus was one of the most powerful and influential states in Eastern Europe. The state had been founded in the late 9th century, when Norsemen, known as the Varangians, established control over the East Slavic tribes. The name Kievan Rus derives from its center, the city of Kiev, which grew into a powerful urban hub and the political and cultural heart of the Federation. Over the next several centuries, Kievan Rus expanded through conquest and alliance, absorbing various Slavic, Baltic, and Finnic peoples. At its height, during the 11th century, Kievan Rus was a prosperous state with a rich culture, extensive trade routes connecting it to Byzantium, Scandinavia, and the Arab world, and a strong military presence. However, by the early 13th century, the unity of Kievan Rus began to fracture. The once centralized power of Kiev started to disintegrate as rival principalities and city-states vied for dominance. Political infighting and succession disputes weakened the state, and the development of local power centers further eroded Kiev's position as the heart of the realm. The decline of Kievan Rus was compounded by external pressures, particularly from the east. The Mongols, led by the great Genghis Khan, and later his descendants, had built a vast and formidable empire that stretched across Asia. By the early 13th century, the Mongols had begun their westward expansion, and Kievan Rus would soon fall victim to their unstoppable military machine. The Mongol Empire had grown rapidly under the leadership of Genghis Khan, who united the various Mongol tribes in the early 13th century. After his death in 1227, his successors continued to expand the empire, pushing westward across the Eurasian steppe. The Mongols were a highly disciplined and skilled military force, using innovative tactics such as the feigned retreat and highly mobile cavalry units that could outmaneuver even the most established armies. By 1236, Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, was given command of the Mongol forces in the west. He was tasked with subjugating the Cumans and the various states of Eastern Europe, including the Kievan Rus. Batu's forces first attacked the Bulgars and then began their invasion of the Rus territories in 1237. The Mongols were well prepared for the invasion of Kievan Rus. The Rus principalities were politically fragmented, with various rival factions often at odds with each other. The Mongols took advantage of these divisions, targeting the most vulnerable states first and exploiting the lack of a unified defense. The first major attack came in 1237, when Batu Khan's army laid siege to Ryazan, a major city in the southeastern part of Kievan Rus. Ryazan was a relatively small principality, but it was strategically important, located along the trade routes from the east. The city's defense was led by Prince Yuri of Ryazan, but despite a determined resistance, Ryazan fell to the Mongols in December 1237 after a brutal siege. The Mongols reportedly massacred much of the population and razed the city to the ground, leaving no survivors. The Mongols then turned their attention to Vladimir, one of the most important cities in the Kievan Rus, which had served as the capital of the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal. Vladimir had been a powerful city and the seat of the Grand Prince of Kievan Rus for much of the 12th century. However, by the time of the Mongol invasion, Vladimir was no longer the political center it once had been. Nonetheless, its fall marked a significant moment in the Mongol campaign. In February 1238, Batu's forces arrived at Vladimir and began their siege. The defenders, led by Prince Andrei of Vladimir, put up a strong resistance, but they were no match for the Mongol war machines. After a short but intense siege, the city fell. Like Ryazan, Vladimir was destroyed, its buildings burned to the ground, and its population either killed or taken captive. The destruction of Vladimir further undermined the Kievan Rus and set the stage for the fall of its final stronghold, Kiev. Kiev, the spiritual and cultural heart of Kievan Rus, was the final city in the Mongols' campaign to subdue the region. By the time Batu Khan's forces reached Kiev in 1240, the city had already seen its power significantly diminished. Kiev's political influence had waned, with many of the Rus principalities having moved their capitals elsewhere. Nevertheless, Kiev remained a symbol of the Rus' past glory, and its fall would mark the definitive collapse of Kievan Rus. Kiev was well fortified, and its defenders, led by Prince Mstislav the Kievan, initially hoped to repel the Mongols. However, the Mongol forces were overwhelming, with Batu Khan deploying both his own troops and reinforcements from neighboring Mongol tribes. The siege of Kiev began in November 1240, and despite fierce resistance, the city fell to the Mongols after a month-long siege. Once inside, the Mongols slaughtered the inhabitants of Kiev, including civilians, soldiers, and clergy. The city was thoroughly sacked, and the grand churches and monasteries that had once been symbols of the Rus Orthodox Christian faith were destroyed. The destruction of Kiev was not only a military defeat, but a symbolic blow to the entire Kievan Rus. It signified the end of the once powerful state and the beginning of a long period of Mongol domination over the region. The fall of Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev to the Mongols signaled the collapse of the Kievan Rus as a political entity. The Mongol invasion shattered the unity of the Rus states, and the region was now divided into several smaller, fragmented principalities, many of which were forced to pay tribute to the Mongol Empire. The Mongols established a loose but effective rule over the region, known as the Mongol yoke. Under Mongol rule, the Rus principalities were allowed a degree of autonomy, but were required to pay heavy tributes to the Mongols. The Mongols also installed their own governors, known as Baskaks, to oversee the collection of tribute and maintain order. This system of indirect rule allowed the Mongols to extract wealth from the region without directly administering it, but it also led to the degradation of the once flourishing cities of Kievan Rus. The Mongol yoke had lasting effects on the region's political, economic, and social landscape. Many of the principalities that had once been part of Kievan Rus, such as Novgorod, Smolensk, and Chernigov, found themselves at the mercy of the Mongols. Over time, however, some of the Rus princes began to consolidate power and resist Mongol control, most notably the Grand Duchy of Moscow. The Mongols, despite their initial dominance, could not completely suppress the regional identities of the Rus people. Over time, Moscow emerged as a key center of resistance against Mongol rule. By the late 14th century, under the leadership of Grand Prince Dmitry Donskoy, Moscow had successfully defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Kulikovo, 1380. This was a turning point in the region's struggle for independence. Despite this, it would not be until the late 15th century, under Ivan III, Ivan the Great, that the Mongol yoke was definitively lifted and the Grand Duchy of Moscow was able to establish itself as the dominant power in the region. This marked the beginning of the rise of the Russian Empire and the end of Mongol influence in Eastern Europe. The Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus had a profound and lasting impact on the history of Eastern Europe. The destruction of cities like Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev, as well as the subsequent fragmentation of the Kievan Rus, reshaped the political landscape of the region. The Mongols' ability to conquer vast territories and their sophisticated military strategies changed the way warfare was conducted in the region, leaving a legacy that influenced both Russian and European military tactics for generations. Additionally, the Mongol yoke left an indelible mark on the cultural and economic development of the region. While some scholars argue that the Mongols stifled the region's growth by imposing tribute and direct control over trade routes, others contend that Mongol rule indirectly contributed to the rise of Moscow as a power center. The Mongols' economic policies, particularly their control over trade routes, helped solidify the role of the Grand Duchy of Moscow as a trading hub in the late Middle Ages.